Welcome to True Crime Threads. A family's world unravels in a web of betrayal. The Johnson family appeared to have everything anyone could want. Greg Johnson, a well-respected businessman, had built a successful career from the ground up. Angela, his wife, was the epitome of a devoted homemaker, always organizing community events, volunteering at the local school, and ensuring their home was a welcoming sanctuary. Their daughter, Janice, was the picture of a bright, determined teenager. With her exceptional athletic abilities, she was bound for a college scholarship, her future seemingly as bright as her family's reputation. From the outside, the Johnsons were admired by everyone who knew them. Their life was one that many envied. Despite the outward perfection, there were small cracks forming behind the scenes. The first sign of trouble was Greg's increasing absences. It started off as occasional late nights at the office, a few extra hours here and there to meet deadlines or attend important meetings. Angela didn't think much of it at first. After all, Greg's job required him to work long hours, especially as his business continued to grow. But over time, the late nights became more frequent, stretching into weekends and even extending into family holidays. Greg would claim that work demanded his attention, or that he had urgent business to attend to, but Angela couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Janice, too, began noticing the changes. Her father, who had once been her biggest supporter, was no longer present at her games. He missed parent-teacher conferences and failed to show up for family dinners. He had always been the type to ask about her day or offer advice after school, but now his attention was diverted elsewhere. His smile no longer felt warm or genuine. He was distant, preoccupied with something she couldn't understand. She even caught him looking at his phone with an odd intensity, something he had never done before. Angela began asking questions, but Greg's responses were always vague and defensive. He would assure her everything was fine and that the business needed him now more than ever. But Angela wasn't convinced. She tried to push aside the growing worry in her gut, dismissing it as the natural stresses of his career. But deep down, she knew something was shifting. What started as small, subtle changes were beginning to pile up into something that couldn't be ignored. Their once perfect family, so tightly bound by love and trust, was starting to unravel, though neither of them had any idea just how far that unraveling would go. It began innocently enough, as these things often do. Sage, Janice's best friend, had always been a regular part of the Johnson family's life. She was a few years older than Janice, but the two had been inseparable since childhood. Sage would often come over after school to study or stay for dinner if her parents were busy. Greg had always liked her, calling her one of the family, and Angela would often chat with her about school or life in general. But as the months passed, Sage began spending more and more time at their house. At first, it didn't seem out of the ordinary. She was still Janice's best friend, after all, and the Johnsons had always welcomed her. However, Janice started to notice the way Greg looked at Sage. It wasn't the same way he looked at her or Angela. His gaze lingered a little too long, and his tone when he spoke to her had an unusual softness to it. He would make little comments, asking if she was comfortable or if she needed anything. Janice had seen her father show kindness before, but there was something different about this. It wasn't just kindness, it was a kind of attention that felt out of place. Janice didn't think much of it at first, assuming she was imagining things. But as time went on, she couldn't ignore the growing tension between them. She had caught glimpses of Sage and Greg in the kitchen on several occasions, having private conversations that Janice couldn't quite make out. It felt like a secret world that didn't include her. At dinner, Greg's focus was often on Sage, asking about her plans for the future or commenting on how well she was doing in her studies. When Greg spoke to Sage, it was as though he was listening intently, hanging on every word. Janice couldn't remember the last time she had received that kind of attention from him. It wasn't just the way Greg treated Sage that bothered Janice, it was the way Sage seemed to be enjoying it. Sage, once just a carefree friend, now seemed to revel in the attention Greg gave her. There were moments when Janice caught her smiling in a way that made her feel uncomfortable, as if they shared a secret that Janice wasn't privy to. But what bothered her the most was the sudden shift in her own father. Greg, who had always been so involved in her life, was becoming more and more distant, especially when Sage was around. Janice couldn't put her finger on it, but something in the air had changed, and she knew she couldn't ignore it forever. Janice's heart pounded in her chest as she stood in the doorway, staring at the coffee table in front of her. Her hands trembled, and she had to take a deep breath to steady herself. There, partially hidden beneath a stack of magazines, was a receipt from an expensive hotel. She recognized the name immediately, the same hotel that had been in the city for years. A place Greg had always said was too expensive for a family weekend. The date on the receipt, though, was what made Janice's stomach churn. It was the same date Greg had claimed to be on a business trip, one of the many trips he had taken in recent months, each one stretching into days rather than hours. Janice felt a sickening sense of dread creep up her spine as she picked up the receipt. The more she examined it, the more she realized that it wasn't just a slip-up. The date, the location, the amount, it all pointed to one thing: Greg had lied. He hadn't been at some business meeting, he had been in a hotel, likely with someone, and she knew exactly who that someone was. Sage, her best friend. The girl who had become more and more involved in their lives in recent months, the girl who had become a shadow in their home. Janice's thoughts raced as she struggled to process what she was seeing. There was no way she could be mistaken. The more she thought about the way Sage and Greg acted around each other, the strange looks, the private conversations, the more everything started to make sense. What she had only suspected before now felt undeniable. Janice's hands shook as she let the receipt fall back onto the table. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think straight. The betrayal was so overwhelming she felt like she might collapse under the weight of it. It wasn't just that Greg had been lying to her mother, it was that he had been lying to her. All this time he had been sneaking around, betraying the family, and she had been too naive to see it. Her mind raced as she replayed every conversation, every moment she'd spent with Sage. The way her friend had smiled too brightly, laughed a little too easily when Greg was around. The way Greg had become more distracted when Sage was in the house, how his attention had shifted from Janice to her friend, as though she was more important. Janice could no longer ignore the truth, even though it felt impossible to accept. It was too painful to acknowledge, but it was all too real. The betrayal had already begun, and it had taken the form of the one person Janice had trusted most: her father's affair with her best friend. Janice couldn't keep the truth inside any longer. The weight of it pressed down on her, and every moment felt like a slow suffocation. Her heart raced as she approached Greg one evening, a quiet storm brewing inside her. It had been days since she had found the receipt, but it hadn't gotten any easier. If anything, the unease had grown, gnawing at her from the inside out. She couldn't continue pretending that everything was fine, not with the knowledge she carried. Greg was in the living room, as usual, reading through papers for work. Janice could hear the soft rustling of pages as she stood frozen at the doorway, trying to steady her breath. Her hands were clammy and her chest tightened, as though the air itself had become thick and suffocating. This was it. This was the moment she had to confront him. "Dad," she said, her voice shaking despite her best efforts. Greg looked up from his papers, his expression soft and unreadable. Janice's throat felt dry. She tried to find her words, to control the anger and hurt that surged within her, but it was difficult. Everything she had been holding in for so long threatened to spill out. "I found something," she managed, her voice faltering slightly. Greg's face softened, as if bracing for what she might say next. Her eyes locked onto his, searching for any sign of guilt, but all she saw was confusion. She could feel the tension between them growing. "I know about the hotel," she continued, unable to keep the edge out of her voice. "I know about the business trips, and I know you weren't really working. I saw the receipt. Greg's expression faltered for a moment. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. A deep silence hung in the air, and Janice could see the flicker of realization in his eyes. He knew he had been caught, but he didn't want to admit it. Her heart pounded painfully in her chest as Greg finally lowered his gaze. "Janice, it's not what you think," he said, his voice strained. But the words felt hollow. Janice couldn't listen to him anymore. She already knew. She had known for days. With her hands clenched into fists, Janice forced herself to take a step back. She had never felt so betrayed. "No, Dad. It's exactly what I think," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The man she had looked up to, the man she had trusted more than anyone in the world, had shattered everything. And then, without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving Greg standing there with nothing left to say. The truth had been spoken, but it hadn't made any of it easier to bear. The fallout from Greg's confession was swift and brutal. The shock and anger Angela felt were impossible to contain, and she confronted Greg the moment Janice walked away. She didn't ask questions, didn't wait for explanations, she already knew everything. The shattered trust between them was too much for her to bear. She had always believed in their marriage, had trusted him with everything, but now that trust was destroyed. She could see the truth in Janice's eyes and hear it in the way her voice trembled as she confronted Greg. There was no denying what had happened. The betrayal was too deep. Angela's pain turned to rage. She couldn't look at Greg without seeing his lies, without thinking of the years he had spent building a facade that had come crashing down. Every time she looked at him, she saw not the man she had loved, but the man who had thrown everything away for a fleeting affair with a girl who had once been like a daughter to her. Greg tried to explain, but his words felt empty. He apologized, of course, but it meant nothing now. It was too late. There was no fixing what he had done. Janice, devastated by the confrontation, withdrew into herself. She couldn't stay in the house, not with the reminder of her father's betrayal at every corner. She moved in with her aunt, a quiet woman who lived on the other side of town. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it was enough to get her away from the wreckage of her family. Every part of her wanted to scream, to demand answers she would never get. But mostly she felt lost. How could she ever look at her father again? How could she ever trust anyone the way she had once trusted him? The pain cut too deeply for her to put into words. Greg's life, too, began to unravel. His business, once a successful and well-respected enterprise, faltered as word of his affair spread. He was no longer the trusted figure he once was. His reputation, and his companies were tarnished beyond repair. Greg had made a choice that not only destroyed his family but also everything he had worked for. He had risked it all for a fleeting moment of satisfaction, and now he was left with nothing. Sage, too, found herself at the center of the fallout. Her relationship with Janice was irreparably damaged. She, too, faced the judgment of her friends, her family, and everyone who had once trusted her. The girl who had been a bright part of Janice's life had become the symbol of everything that had gone wrong. Sage was no longer the girl Janice had grown up with. She was a stranger, a betrayer. In the end, the Johnson family was left broken. The betrayal had torn apart a once perfect family, leaving behind only fragments of what it had been. The damage was irreversible, and there was no turning back. What remained was the painful aftermath, a series of shattered lives that would never fully heal. The family Greg had once built, and the life Janice had once known, was now nothing more than a memory.